Welcome. Welcome, everyone. This is the opening event of Citizen Climate's Lobby 2015 Northern California Regional Conference. I'm Harold Hedelman. I'm a volunteer and a regional coordinator for CCL, which stands for Citizens Climate Lobby, in case we say that too often. CCL is an international, nonpartisan nonprofit. We produced tonight's event in pursuit of our mission, which is creating the political will for a livable planet. You'll find out more about us in the program material, which is on your seats. And if you find tonight's presentation valuable, I want to encourage you to do three things. Make a generous donation. Surprise. Consider joining CCL, which is free, and get involved in a chapter near you. You can find out about that on our website, citizensclimatelobby.org.
This is amazing to be with you here on Friday night. I'm honored. Thank you for the invitation. I've been doing climate events for 40 or 50 years for the last 7 years, and gradually noticed that these people would come up and identify themselves at the microphone from Citizens Climate Lobby, and okay, and then there's another one, and another one, and another one. So I've watched the group grow over the years, and I think it strikes a very important tone in the conversation. The tone of voice and the questions are different than you hear from other voices in the climate debate, and so I think it's a really important organization. I appreciate being here. I haven't been in this room since I interviewed Hillary Clinton here 5 years ago when she made news about the Keystone Pipeline. It looked at that point like it was going to be approved pretty quickly. Still hasn't happened. I'm going to introduce the panelists real briefly, and we'll get right to it. Just by organization and name going down, we have Kevin Krick, who's the California Republican Party Bay Area Regional Vice Chair. Bruce. Going to be a lot of clapping tonight. Okay. Bruce Hamilton is the Sierra Club Deputy Executive Director. Bill Shireman is the CEO and President of Future 500, which does engagement, stakeholder engagement. Ian Adams is the Western Region Director for the R Street Institute, which spun out of the Heartland Institute. Kate Gordon is a road warrior who's been flying all over and to be with us here tonight, and she's leaving again soon. She's the Senior VP and Director of the Energy and Climate Programs at Next Generation, part of Steyer World. Paul Nahi is the President and CEO of Enphase Energy. And Mark Reynolds is the Executive Director of the Citizens Climate Lobby. We're going to begin with a yes or no question for each panelist, just to get everyone kind of a little bit of stretching going on. Kevin, yes or no, cap and trade hurt the California economy?
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Ian, it's possible to price carbon without talking about a carbon price.
Yes.
Bill, carbon price can be achieved as part of an overall tax reform.
Absolutely, yes.
Bruce, the CCL approach to carbon price is practical.
Yes.
That's not what you said when we talked on the phone, but okay. Okay. Kate, a carbon price should be a campaign issue in the next election, national election cycle.
No in the primaries, yes in the general.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
All right. And one follow-up. Tom Steyer is going to be running for some office in that next election. Yes or no?
No comment.
Mark, carbon price must steer money to poor people.
No.
Paul, the green industry has been effective at making its presence known in the halls of political power.
No.
Okay. Well, good. We've got a lot there. I want to get to where the money goes because I talked with each of these people beforehand, and you all are deep into the conversation. You're part of CCL. You were coerced to come here by someone who's in CCL, and invited to come join us. And so a lot of the issues about, okay, pricing carbon, great, but really where the rubber hits the road is where does the money go? And maybe we'll pick up there with Mark in terms of if it doesn't go to poor people, Mark, where should the money go?
It should go evenly distributed to all households for a couple of reasons. One is people do need a way of mitigating their increase in costs, and everybody needs that. And if you had some type of scaled tier where poor people get more money than rich people, you don't get any Republican votes. So you have to do something that both is fair to everybody but has a chance of getting support from both sides of the aisle. We prefer that be done as a monthly dividend check. And I like what Secretary Schultz says about that. He says the dividend is the most honest, transparent, hardest to rig solution. So a lot of people prefer some type of tax swap. We prefer that it goes as a dividend and it's dealt with equally to every household.
And that's an actual physical paper check so that you get something and you open it up. And
and I think that's really important.
The Ed McMahon moment sort of thing.
Yeah, because I mean, the thing about it is think about, here we are in California. And under AB 32, we all get a credit on our utility bill, but nobody knows it.
Has anyone ever seen that on your bill?
Yeah.
A few people. Yeah, it's there.
It is there, but nobody knows. So we missed a huge chance to generate a lot of goodwill towards that bill by people not seeing something physical like an actual check they received.
I interviewed an author who wrote the New Deal, and he talked about the difference between the Bush and the Obama stimulus plans. The Bush, I remember getting a $300 check from George Bush. President Obama put direct deposit. It was less visible to people, which economists said it was more likely to be spent that way, but it had less visible and tangible impact. People didn't know they got it. Bill Shireman, where do you think the money should go?
What type of carbon tax?
From pricing carbon, where should the money flow to? Should it go into Americans' pockets? Should it go to others?
I think there are so many ways that a carbon tax can be done effectively and virtuously that I don't want to overly restrict us. My personal preference is to cut employee payroll taxes and corporate taxes, the most regressive individual taxes and the most regressive small business taxes that we have. I think that's the best. $70 a ton carbon tax could eliminate the employee side payroll tax. $30 a ton carbon tax could eliminate the corporate tax, which most corporations that are of any size get out of significantly anyway. So I think that's the best way, but I am not going to impose my litmus test on the system. There are lots of ways we can do this right.
Does anyone believe that it needs to go to poor countries, poor people, to address the equity issue, Bruce?
Well, money needs to go there, whether it is the money from a particular fee on a particular source of carbon is another question. But one way or another, there's a whole bunch of inequities that need to be addressed. We have worker transition, just transition issues of people losing their jobs, coal miners and others, and they aren't going to get that resolved just by getting a dividend check. There are countries that are going underwater right now due to the impacts that the United States, as the biggest polluter on the planet, and now China, we're the ones causing the problem. Somebody's got to pay for that. If some of the developing nations want to leapfrog fossil fuels and go straight to renewable energy, they need some money to help do that. So some of that money has to come from somewhere. We have right now a carbon tax on gas, and a lot of that goes into filling the potholes. So I just think there are lots of needs we have, and you can't just turn around and say, every bit that we raise for carbon, we need to turn around and give back to the consumers because there's a bunch of other things we need to do. We've got to fund the renewable energy transition because it's not going to happen just by giving money back to consumers. I really think that to get it going as fast as it needs to go, a lot more needs to be done. And the other thing is that if the fees aren't high enough, then we aren't really solving the problem.
Let's go to Kate and then Paul.
I mean, I largely agree with what Bruce just said. I think there's two areas that we have to take seriously in terms of money being available. One is, as Bruce just talked about, there's a transition cost. I mean, those of us, I was a pioneer of the green jobs movement. I was there from the beginning. And I will say that we were not as focused as we should have been on the reality of the transition cost to people in moving toward this new energy economy. There are, particularly in coal-dependent communities, but also here in California, Kern County just filed for bankruptcy. It's a fossil fuel dependent community. Yes, it has a great, huge wind farm and a solar farm, but it is a its number one taxpayer is oil. That is not a false statement. It's a real issue that we have to deal with, and I think we have to pay attention to the transition costs and be honest about them. The other thing is that, and I struggle with this all the time, is what do we do about infrastructure? So having an energy transition will require a major infrastructure investment. Our current energy system required a major infrastructure investment. The highway system is an energy system. The grid is an energy system. These were public investments on infrastructure that were done at a massive scale. I don't see the political will to do that right now from the public sector. I don't see the will from the private sector to build infrastructure. I see the will to innovate and to create conditions that are, meeting these new standards that we've created, and it's very exciting, but who's going to build the infrastructure? So those two things, to me, are a serious question. How do we deal with the transition costs, and how do we deal with infrastructure investments in the current political environment if we don't spend some of these dollars on those two things?
Paul, I want to come back to Kevin here for this essentially a wealth transfer issue, but Paul, thoughts on the pricing and where the revenues goes, or whether some of that's necessary to feed new industries, new clean technology industries?
Right. So I think it's, while I certainly agree that these are valid needs and there are cash that can go there and it can benefit a lot of people, but I think injecting social policy into this discussion is very dangerous. I think what happens is you provide more reasons why it's not going to work. You make it a partisan issue. The fact is that the transition from a fossil fuel economy into a clean energy economy needs to be driven, frankly, by the economic benefits of going to a clean energy economy. I think if we rely on people's better nature, if we go lobbyist to lobbyist against the oil industry, we're going to lose both those fights. If you look at what solar has done to date, and the reason that solar is on fire as an industry is for one reason. It's because it is now cheaper than utility energy. It's not because it's better, it's not because it's cleaner. As much as I'd like to think that was the case, we know by fact that what's driving people are the economics. If we can identify what exactly is the problem we're trying to fix, if we agree that the problem we're trying to fix is that the planet is undeniably warming, we are causing it, and that if we do not make a massive shift, the future is at risk. The only way we can make the shift that the size of the shift that is necessary to address this problem is by including the entire economy. As much as I respect and I appreciate NGOs and civil societies and nonprofits, the reality is that's nowhere near enough to affect the change that we need to affect. So if the decision is, if the goal is, let's change this planet, let's carve out a role for social policy. It is a powerful, important element. But let's not confuse what we need to do in order to clean the planet with that. By cleaning the planet, by building a clean energy economy, we will be putting a lot of money into the coffers of states, at the state and the national level, and at that point we can decide what to do with it. But I believe that they're two different discussions.
There is much broader and deeper support for a carbon tax shift than is popularly understood. This is the most widely considered politically impossible idea in Washington, D.C. And the reason that people try to define it as politically impossible is because they know once it gets its roots, it has the capacity to go. But we have to be careful not to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory here, and I can see it happening in this room. You know, we had a cap and trade bill a few years ago that conceptually was a really good idea, and it ended up being a Christmas tree, a $500 billion a year Christmas tree for, vested interests that got in line for it. So let's be really careful. There are a lot of Republicans out there who are skeptical about climate, not because they actually doubt the science, but because they fear the solutions that will be imposed on them. And if we start talking about this as another $500 billion that we can farm out, you can bet that the coal miners that need these dollars are going to be standing in line behind every group in Congress that can veto this bill if we start treating it as a money tree. We have to recognize that the carbon tax alone, a revenue-neutral carbon tax, in fact, a revenue-negative carbon tax in British Columbia generated a 10% reduction in per capita carbon in 3 years. That was it started at $10, went up $5 a year. That alone, now that beats every trading system that I've ever had experience with. So that reduces taxes. It's a Republican dream, it's a progressive dream, and it's an environmental success. That's what we have to focus on here.
Mark, many of the advocates for a carbon tax present it as this elegant, simple, clean solution, and yet we know that nothing gets through Congress that is elegant, simple, or clean. Even if a tax were to pass, the lobbyists would worm away at it year after year until it would look like the Australian carbon tax, which is Swiss cheese. So address that for us. That there's
I think that's part of why you have to be so pure and clean up front, because once you start making deals, where does it stop? So part of the reason that we think we have to be so simple and straightforward, you know, you have a steadily escalating fee, you give all the money back to households, and then everybody starts bringing up exceptions. Once you start saying yes to that, where does it stop? Anybody would be naive to think that you could get something reconciled through the House and the Senate that didn't have some horse trading. You know, look at Mitch McConnell. 92% of Kentucky's electricity comes from coal mined in the state of Kentucky. He ought to fight with all he has for that. But that is his obligation as a senator in the state of Kentucky. But we shouldn't be offering something like that up front. I think it's absolutely essential that we keep as pure, as simple as message up front to get as many people on board. You know, we met with 1,002 congressional offices last year, equal number of Republicans and Democrats. I don't know one Republican office we met with that says if it's not revenue neutral, we go forward. So you have to both try and do something that's simple and transparent, but you also have to do something that I think has enough political legs to pass, knowing that you're not going to end up ultimately getting exactly what you want.
And the only way to get that is to have a bipartisan approach. We know that Republicans are going to be the margin of victory on this. There's no other way for it to happen. So we know that there has to be Republican support. And the best way to get Republican support for this is to utilize it as a revenue neutral model. There will be, as you say, some horse trading in the end. There will be Republicans that will step forward for some income redistribution because they will want to provide some compensation to dislocated workers and so on. They will. But we cannot start out with that or we will destroy ourselves and we'll end up with a bill that will be counterproductive.
Well, let's talk about that scenario for those. We always hear about a lot of Republicans in the closet on climate. And
across the board. So.
And the potential of a prison break, where if one of them tries to run across the sand, they'll get shot. But if they all break out of prison at the same time, that they might make it, right? So, but what's going to be the catalyst for that conversion, for that political change, for people to come speak publicly what they're saying privately?
Yeah, I don't think anybody knows the exact answer to that, but I think all of us have to be heartened by the votes in the Senate a couple of weeks ago. When was the last time any of us saw a vote that 15 Republican senators said burning fossil fuels contributed to global warming, and 5 said it contributed significantly? That's, I don't think since 2009 we've seen Republicans vote on anything like that. So I think that's significant.
But Ian, you think that was a bad idea?
I think that was a bad idea. You were asking all of those Republicans who, behind closed doors, we had a good sense of the fact that they were probably the ones willing to stand up, and we asked them to run across the prison yard and get shot. And a lot of them have, and they're taking a lot of flack as a result of that. So I think, reaching out and speaking to these Republicans in terms that Bill refers to and talking about revenue neutrality, that's the way you start to convert them, but you don't ask them to come out until it looks like you can actually move forward.
That is absolutely true. And I think what's going to enable a revenue neutral carbon tax to go through is when we get, and we will get there because we get there every year or so, to a budget and or fiscal crisis where we have to begin to reform the tax system. And that's when these good ideas will come forward, and they will not be campaign promises because this issue is too easy to use as a wedge. You will not see major politicians out there using a carbon tax as the centerpiece for their public campaign, but you will see plenty that will say quietly in meetings, yes, when it comes down to sitting in the back room and figuring out how we're going to solve this problem, this is an idea that we know we can go forward with. So do not force politicians to commit political suicide by coming out publicly on this specific issue. Have them come out and indicate that they want to do something about climate, that they have a positive, but make sure that behind the scenes they know the facts, they know why this is good. They have heard from every company that needs to have more money in consumer pockets, and that is every major retailer and every major consumer brand. That's where Citizens Climate Lobby can make a huge difference to get those brands across the line. They can publicly support that. When they do, the politicians will follow.
Kate and then Bruce.
So we just at Next Generation just went through a 2-year process of bringing Republicans and Democrats together around climate risk as an issue and learned a lot from that process. The Risky Business Project brought Mike Bloomberg, Hank Paulson, and Tom Steyer together as the co-chairs of a committee that also included Olympia Snowe, George Schultz, Bob Rubin, Henry Cisneros, a number of people, and was incredibly interesting, and some lessons from that. And I spent a lot of time recruiting those people and also others who declined to join for time reasons, but had a lot of conversations with a lot of Republicans on this subject. And I will say that one of the reasons that we were able to get that group together was because we did not include policy solutions in the document. The way the Risky Business Project is laid out is that it is a cold, business-friendly climate assessment. It's a risk assessment on climate. It's very understandable to the business community. It's a very standard way to look at issues that have some uncertainty in the future, but for which businesses have to plan. It's the way we do war and terrorism planning. It's the way that we do planning on extreme weather. We essentially made the argument that we need to do the same kind of planning on climate change. And this group of people disagree wholeheartedly on a number of the solutions that people in this room want to see happen, but they all believed that we needed to understand the problem and that we needed to be able to face those risks and deal with them. And I actually think that's pretty important because I was even surprised at the level at which the Republicans we worked with did not want this to be a public issue, did not want carbon tax in particular to be a public issue. It was really, they were very comfortable with the risk space and talking about reacting to risk, and actually, back to the infrastructure point, very comfortable with the idea of integrating climate risk into infrastructure decisions. I actually think we could get farther in the next 2 years with an infrastructure bill that incorporated climate risk than we could with a carbon tax bill. But I agree, mostly with your point about doing this behind closed doors. What we did find was that following up on that report, I've probably had 30 meetings with industry leaders in multinational industries around the country. Every single meeting that starts with a discussion of climate risk within 20 minutes gets to the limits of corporate adaptation and the need for some kind of a public policy solution. Every meeting. That is not going to happen in a public meeting with media there. It will absolutely happen in those private meetings. And I do believe that what we need to do for the next 2 years, this is why I said no in the primary, yes in the general, we need for the next 2 years to spend time doing those private meetings and getting to a deal behind closed doors with industry leaders and conservatives that's a deal that can be brought to the table, that's already fully fleshed out, that's not about infighting in public. And I think we can. I actually am optimistic we can get to some kind of a price after that. But I think this moment is not the moment for a big public debate where we're calling people out on this issue. It's still too toxic.
I hope there's some, as a guy who runs a radio show, I hope there's still some public discussion that goes on. Otherwise, I'm in trouble. I'll be looking for a job.
Absolutely. This is just, let me just be clear, this is one lane. I mean, this is the sort of the business conservative lane. There are many other lanes in which people should be active on this issue and absolutely should be out there. What issue have we ever won in this country where we had only one strategy? We always have multiple strategies. We've got a legal strategy, we've got the activist strategy, we've got the business strategy. We have to be working on all fronts. This is a massive challenge. So absolutely not confining it to behind closed doors.
Okay, the inside game and the outside game. Bruce.
Yeah, I would say that the recent vote on climate in Congress wasn't a vote about we want to take action on climate. That was a vote that the Democrats set up in order to embarrass Republicans leading up to the next election and putting them on record.
Is that a good idea?
Pardon me?
Is that constructive?
For the Democrats, yes. For moving the issue, I don't believe so. I mean, I agree totally with Kate. I'm all in favor of passing the CCL bill. But at the same time, I don't believe in a silver bullet. I think we need silver buckshot. And there's just lots of different ways to do this. Just this week in Illinois, there was a cap and invest bill that was introduced by 36 bipartisan members. And it basically takes the revenues and turns around, puts 2/3 of it into renewables and 1/3 into job transition and helping low-income people. So you can get Republicans on board something like that too. The only solution to Republicans isn't if you give all the money back. But it depends upon what the local forum is. And so I just think there's lots of different ways to put prices on carbon, and we ought to be exploring them all rather than saying there's one true blue solution. But I'm all for the CCL thing. You know, they introduce it. Sierra Club will endorse it. We'll urge people to vote for it. But, you know, and it's not like, you know, we're then going to lobby to try to make sure all the money goes to poor people. I mean, if, you know, the way to pass it is to keep it intact, fine. I want to see prices on carbon with whatever vehicle works.
Let's use that to pivot to the regional versus federal question. You mentioned Illinois, California, and I want to ask Kevin, you mentioned that AB 32 hurt the California economy. AB 32 only right now goes out to 2020. There's some interest in extending it further. Doing so, depending on how it's interpreted, may require 2/3 votes of the legislature. The business voice in the state will be very important. So unpack for us why you think that AB 32 hurt the California economy.
Sure, certainly be glad to do that. So the view that I take on AB 32 is one of, it was a good solution, but not implemented well. And in that, to define that, I have to say, go back to my point regarding carbon emissions. Wherever you emit, it affects the globe. So henceforth, California likes to do this. They do this a lot in my industry. They like to be on the cutting edge, the leading edge of solutions to environmental issues, which is fine. But in order to be a leader, you have to have followers. And that's where California really drops the ball in many, many cases. And AB 32 is a great example. So instead of building up a consensus and creating a plan that would involve the entirety of the United States so that you couldn't pack up your company and go across the border to Arizona or to New Mexico, or decide to divert your ships to Canada or Mexico, everyone was in this together. And that's, when we look at AB 32, we need to see a solution that has that sort of mindset, but to something that is that it's at a global scale, to be quite honest with you. I mean, right here now in this room, we're talking about something that's a national level, and quite frankly, that would be fine. I mean, we obviously need to start somewhere, but you know, from the global perspective, the more you make the regulations or the taxes, whatever you have facing you, uniform throughout the world, there's less chance that somebody is going to try and shift over someplace else where the light's not as bright and they're out in the corner and they can do whatever they want. So.
Okay, I want to hear from others, maybe Bill and then Paul, about the business case for AB 32, because as much as we can talk about a national carbon price, et cetera, the real meaningful price on carbon in this country is in this state, and that is not locked in for more than 5 years.
Right, so we have to recognize that this can't be just about punishing carbon. Yes, we put a price on carbon. It's the cost of carbon that we're really adjusting to. I really don't view it as a tax. I view it as that is the actual cost of carbon that has not been accounted for. But if you just view it as punishing carbon, I think we're missing the long-term solution. The advantage of doing this, the advantage of putting a price on it, is that not only it sends the correct price signal, but it also creates the appropriate demand. I think one of the biggest challenges that we've had in addressing this, and I think with the best of intentions, one of the biggest mistakes that multiple administrations have made, is trying to fuel supply. The fact is, when you create demand, supply takes care of itself. Supply finds a way. There's enough capital, they're brilliant engineers, they're brilliant entrepreneurs, they will fill that demand. Again, the reason that solar is doing what it is doing today, it's because it's simply less expensive than utility energy. If we can appropriately price, taking into account both the direct, indirect, the negative externalities, if we appropriately price carbon, we will create an unstoppable market for non-carbon-based energy. The technology is there. We have the technology. What we need is the political will to create an economic base to let it thrive. That's all that needs to happen. So anything that gets in the way of that is, for whatever other reason, is addressing the wrong problem. We create the right economic base, we create the demand, supply will address whatever needs are there, and it will do so by building a clean energy economy. That is all within our grasp.
It's important also to recognize that we're moving from an economy that was focused on the fuel that drove growth, the fossil fuel industrial economy, to an economy where here in the Bay Area, this is the capital, of the digital economy globally. We have to stop just thinking in terms of what's going to replace gasoline and natural gas, because what's going to replace it is not solar and wind. For the most part, what's going to replace it is digital technology. That's what's happening right now. In this community, we are multiplying the value that we generate from every unit of energy that we use. And the power of a price on carbon is that it will, yes, enable more solar, more wind, more renewables, but more than that, it will drive digital technologies into the economy in tens of thousands of ways and reduce our need for fossil fuels and for energy. And that's where the greatest benefits will come from. If that is the case, we have to be doubly careful to not create a system that is just a source of cash to be dispensed in Sacramento or in Washington, D.C., as much as we would like to have all of these virtuous causes supported. A friend of mine who's a lobbyist in Sacramento described to me this room that he was in when a group of environmental lobbyists were there to discuss how to divide up some of the pie that was going to be generated by AB 32, and he said it reminded him of 20 golems with Precious in the middle of the table. They all became just like, well, we want this for this, and we want this for this.
But to be clear, that was not the point of AB 32. The point of AB 32 is the cap.
No.
And the cap does create a market. I mean, look at California. California is the 8th largest economy in the world. And we created a market for low emission vehicles by passing the first emission standards. We now have standards for plug-in chargers, which were the first place to have those standards. We're changing the plug-in charger market so there's automatic shut-off valves. We are a place that creates demand. So the cap is the thing. Whether it's, my old boss used to call it sick people fighting over each other's medicine, but whether that's the result, in some cases, that is not the goal.
I'm not saying there shouldn't be a cap. And I'm not saying that we should not pass AB 32. I was a supporter of it, but I want to look at the reality, just be intellectually honest about what happens when we create a big pile of money and put it in a state capital anywhere. This is just what happens. I'm sorry. So let's just be aware of that and say, a lot better to just give it to the people. Now, give a little more proportionally to the poor? Absolutely, I'm totally for that. But let's give it out to the people, because as much as we would like our representatives to give it out in an intellectually honest and virtuous way, it is not going to happen. So let's just take it.
Such a dark view of politicians. Mark, I want to get you in here on the regional versus federal approach. There are some things bubbling up in states. It may be a little bit messy, but let's get your take on the state level.
Yeah, so the direction we've given our chapters is that, we're a very, very focused organization. We think to try and do something as ridiculous as to get a bunch of Republicans to vote for a new tax, and not just a tax, but a carbon tax, requires a unbelievable laser-like focus. Nevertheless, a lot of our groups have on their own said that they are working to pass a price in their state. So CCLers are pushing the efforts in Oregon, Washington, Vermont, Massachusetts, and we're encouraging that. We don't have the wherewithal to give them direction and guidance on that, but we're certainly giving them encouragement. So it's exciting to see. They're using a lot of the same stuff that we've developed that I think is useful to this equation. I think that where we've been useful in the last 6 years is trying to establish a basis that when citizens work with elected officials, they do it on the basis of gratitude, respect for their public service. I think that we as citizens have just really not held ourselves to account for the cesspool that we've provided for elected leaders to work in. You know, we like to say things about them, but we've been terrible. And what, for the most part, most of us have done is talk to people that we agree with and speak to the lowest common denominator for the people we disagree with. So we're not giving those people any direction, but I think them taking the basic CCL methodology, which is to work with people based on what we have in common, not where we're at odds with them, is helping in those efforts.
At some point, though, I mean, one of the failures of cap and trade, it was a process, right? It's just the name cap and trade. What the hell is that, right? It's a process, and I interviewed lots of people deeply in it, and they didn't really understand it, right? I mean, so people come and they say, I'm for a carbon tax. Well, that's just very difficult for a politician to do. You say, I'm for tax reform or tax equity or tax something else. That's a lot more. So there's a branding problem here, Mark, because everyone's here saying, I'm for a tax. Well, imagine what the political messengers do with that.
Yeah, no, there's no question. It's hard. No matter what you do with carbon, it's hard. We're fairly disciplined as an organization calling it carbon fee and dividend, fairly disciplined. But at some point, you have to take on the fact that it is a tax. And, you know, you have to say that out loud enough times to you know, get people in a discussion about it, because it's a tough political lift. There's no question about that. So, you know, I don't think you should be afraid of it. But no matter what arena you're working in, that's a tough political lift.
We got about 5 or 6 minutes left here. The parallel of gay marriage often comes up with something that was impossible. It was this polarized social issue, and it changed faster than many people anticipated. Of course, it took 10 years, right? But a lot of people thought Gavin Newsom was crazy. He was told by the party, don't bring this up. It's politically opportune, and it's not the right time. And then we've seen these court cases and Republicans coming out. So I want to ask whoever would like to on this, the parallel of that, it's not imperfect because accepting gay marriage didn't acquire an individual to pay more or change their lifestyle, right?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about that just because, you know, people talk a lot about this as if we know how it's going to shake out, and we don't. We all have our ideas, and there are theories, there are opinions. None of us know exactly how it's going to go. And that was a really interesting moment where things shifted in our country really quickly. It was almost like overnight that it wasn't okay for people to be married who were gay, and then it was. There was a ton of work behind the scenes, but I think that we need to be ready for that moment and make sure that when it happens, we get something done that actually will hold up and will work over time.
And there's an example just on my branding point, gay marriage. If it had been branded marriage equality, it might have had some different, you had Bruce and then Kate and also Kevin.
Something that happened with the gay marriage fight that was really interesting, I was just talking to somebody who was involved in some of the behind-the-scenes work, was that there was funding for groups to go to almost every group in the country, state by state, locality by locality, who was working on similar issues. So there were people working on civil union, there were people working on adoption rights, there were people working on a huge bullying, a huge host of issues affecting the gay community, and there was funding put in place that allowed organizers to go to each of these groups and basically say, keep doing what you're doing, it's great, but also work on gay marriage. So there was a very local approach that was consistent across the country, and I think that's actually sort of interesting because we're talking about an issue here. Climate and energy are both extraordinarily local issues. When you go around the country and you talk about this stuff, you realize that what is an energy solution in Alaska is so incredibly different than an energy solution in Kentucky or in Maryland or anywhere in the country. We have a very large and diverse country. And the impacts of climate change are felt very locally. So I do think that we need to take at least that page from the gay marriage movement maybe and say there is a need for a local approach that recognizes the conditions on the ground as we're trying to build a national movement.
And water is even more local than energy. Bruce?
Exactly.
Everybody's trying to understand marriage equality and what worked. And I still want to figure it out myself. But I do think that one of the things that didn't happen is they didn't try to go cram it through the Congress and through every state legislature because the legislatures are basically death zones for this. So they went through the courts. And in fact, the people were behind it, but it's just that the elected officials weren't and were afraid of it. And ultimately, they're coming around, so even Obama had a conversion after Joe Biden led him to the altar. So when I look at that and I turn around and try to figure out what we do on climate change, I think we are at a tipping point. But the tipping point, you know, we're looking and seeing how price of solar is dropping, price of wind is dropping, price of fossil fuels is going up. They've crossed. We're now globally and nationally deploying more renewables than we are dirty fossil fuels. So, you know, we're getting there, and we aren't getting there because we've got a universal carbon price, though we could have got there much sooner if we had it, and we definitely need it if we're going to finish the effort. But I just think there's lots and lots of different ways. The reason that Illinois decided to go forward with this bipartisan thing, I don't know if it'll pass or not, but the reason was because of the Obama Clean Power Plan. With that threat looming over them, they said, we've got to figure out how to take action at the state level. What are we going to do to respond to this? And this is what they came up with in a bipartisan way. There are so many things that can happen administratively. If you do the right stuff on coal ash, if you do the right stuff on smog, if you do the right stuff on methane, you know, each of these things are raising the price of carbon, internalizing it, and making renewables more efficient and affordable. If you look at red states like Texas, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and you look at how much clean energy is deployed there, sometimes it's 30, 40, 50% of their power. And it's not because there was a price on carbon, it's because they had renewable portfolio standards and there was a huge market out there for it. So I just think there's lots of different ways to get there, and we've got to use them all.
Kevin?
Thank you. Well, a couple of things. Obviously, we moved along from your question earlier, but I'll jump back to that, the parallels with regard to same-sex marriage. And, you know, just for the record, my county central committee was the first county central committee in the entire United States to support same-sex marriage. So, Marin County. 2 years ago, so we put it on record because we all felt that this was shouldn't be an issue, number one, and the fact of the matter is that 85% of Marin County was in favor of it at the last vote. So it to all of us, it would seem to be just a non-question and a non-answer. It was it was a green light from the get-go. Republicans are very much of the mindset that the concern of the environment is huge, and I mean it's been that way for quite some time. And even though we get a bad rap for that, somehow or another we're pegged as anti-environment. And a lot of that I think comes because of the fact that you start merging in these different concerns, one of them being that if you wanted to put a carbon tax forward and the next thing you know it's got all these little carve-outs, and that's something that's anathema to Republicans. So getting them to see a very streamlined approach, it ties right in with the whole philosophy of limited government, having something that is just a very short bill that says here's the goal, here's the ways to the goal, and here's how we do it. Will go a much longer way than something that's 300,000 pages thick in 2-point font that you have to figure out where the actual activity is. And concurrently along with that is the legislators need to know the pulse of their constituents, and that's the reality. I mean, that's how they're going to move. That's how they act. And by realizing that this is really an issue for the average American, it will make that sell much easier and make that pitch to make some changes here, just that much more streamlined. And it ties right back into the whole streamlined process that Republicans like.
I would like to, if I may, reveal the secret. This is the secret for getting this bill passed on a federal level, and I'm serious about this, and I want everybody just to not let this leak out of this room. Just keep it within this room. And this is an approach that Citizens Climate Lobby is distinctly capable of carrying out, and we've been talking to Mark and Harold about this. It is a form of power that you and we have distinctly, and we have underutilized it. When we focus our efforts on politicians and we try to maneuver them to vote, this is an important thing to do, and we need to keep doing it. Citizens Climate Lobby is doing a great job with it, and you're doing it in a transpartisan manner. That's fabulous. Where you can have even more power is by directing that same influence to consumer products, companies, and retailers. These are the entities. They have lobbyists in every state capital and in Washington, D.C. More important, they are at the top of the food chain. They are at the top of the supply chain. They control the dollars. They decide who they're going to buy from. And if they're consumers with a transpartisan group like CCL, if their consumers are coming to them and saying it's important to us and hence to your reputation that you support a revenue neutral price on carbon, it's important to us and we want to see you doing that. Believe me, a small number of citizens, amply organized as you are, can convince them to do that. And when they do that, believe me, their K Street lobbyists do not want to do that right now because they have been told very explicitly, if you come out heavily for climate legislation, you will be punished on the issues that are most at heart for you. So their lobbyists are facing real challenges when it comes to being corporate leaders on climate. You have to get them out of that. And the only way that you can get them out of that is by putting pressure on their companies to say, this is what we expect of you. If you do that, you will have corporate support in every legislative district. And you will have the capacity to have these lobbyists behind the scenes. You don't have to go in, you'll go in too, but you can go in with them. And when they go in, they'll be having the conversations. This is what we need. The magic about this is that your dividend approach, as well as the revenue neutral tax swap approach, puts more money in consumers' pockets, which means that every one of these companies that you're favoring benefits from this law. They want to support it. So you begin to do that, and you will change the politics of this, and nobody will see it coming. Just don't tell anybody outside this room.